If you're building your ABA company and you're tired of guessing, this is for you. We built the BCBA blueprint to give you real structure, systems, and support without the fluff. Details are in the description. Welcome, everyone. This is our first roundtable on the ABA Business Challenges platform. Really excited to have all these people that we know individually, and I get to talk to them all the time. Mackenzie, Michael, Eleanor, Jerome. So this is a really fun experience to have all these subject matter experts zoomed in on one thing, and that is best practices from clinical all the way through billing on dealing with your denial puzzle. This is going to be a casual talk, but we're going to follow the flow of the client journey through your company. Where does it start? How do we fix it? And then how do we deal with insurance denials that have already happened at the end?
So first off, I've seen a lot of posts in our Facebook group that are blaming the insurance companies, pointing the finger, but our goal is to highlight that it may not be the insurance payers' faults. Sometimes providers make mistakes on the intake process, the sessions themselves, or even the billing process. I wanted to go through some of those errors that the providers can make, and also some systemic issues on the side of the payer, pointing out what both sides may get wrong to figure out how we can avoid denials.
My name is Mackenzie. I'm the Director of Operations for our Ohana Support. We essentially do any and everything a company would need in order to thrive and become more efficient. I think one of the areas that most startups struggle with the most is kind of understanding their verification of benefits process and kind of having a format for gathering the correct information when they get an intake call, right? So that you're brand new, you're excited, you've been doing the door-to-door marketing to your pediatrician's offices, and clients are like, I got somebody finally interested in starting services. What am I supposed to do? So one of the things we first talk about, with all of our clients is just having a process for verification of benefits, right? Like we have a form, and again, like templates are great, but I think every company is a little bit different. And so we kind of just walk them through what are the key intake informations that you need for that client. And then it's about deciding who's actually doing the calling on the verification of benefits. Is it going to be the clinical director? Is that CEO? Is it your billing team? Yeah, it's delegating that part of the process. But again, I think sometimes when they're first starting out, and by them, I mean new ABA company owners, they just don't even know what to know. They get on the phone with the payer and they're like, I have somebody interested in starting ABA services. And they'll be like, okay, well, what's their information? Right. So I always encourage people that the first process is get a picture of the insurance card, right? You need a picture of your client's insurance card so that when you're calling, and they can actually provide the correct information and get the verification of benefits so they know what's their deductible, what's their copay, everything that goes into that process. And I think getting that part right at the beginning reduces the stress level as more intakes start coming in, because then you're not overwhelmed by what am I supposed to do with all this information? Because just as exciting as it is to get that first call for your first client, it's also like, well, what do I do with them? And so we try to help ease that process a little bit of making sure they know what to do with the information that they're actually given for their first client or for their 100th client.
I'm Eleanor. I'm from Clear Clinical Consulting. I'm so sorry. My camera's off. Had a long travel day. And I do consulting work for ABA companies. My main thing is I'm helping organize their central reach reports, notes, and forms, making sure that not just that they're, doing all the things that central reach needs them to do, right? Because it's a finicky system, but I'm also a behavior analyst, so I can look at it from a clinical side too. So if I'm helping to redo your treatment plans, I'm also doing it from the lens of a clinical perspective. To kind of go on what you were saying, Mackenzie, I think it's so important to do that verification of benefits and take that one step. I don't know if one step further is the right way, but I've been seeing benefits, like verification of benefits, and then there's confusion if this is right or if it's a wrong check. And I think that's super important to verify the information that you're getting, making sure that this is actually what the parents are going to owe, or do we accept this insurance, or whatever that means. I think another thing about the intake process that's super important is know your funder and what documentation they need for that diagnostic report. So it is very common that not all funders require this, but depending on the state that you're in, that you're submitting that diagnostic report when you're asking for a prior authorization for assessment or even treatment, right? To see if they have a covered benefit or whatever that looks like. And you have to submit that diagnostic report. And what are those requirements? Does it need to be conducted in the same state where is the diagnostician need to be within the same state? Does it need to be a medical doctor? Can it be a licensed psychologist? A lot of times those school diagnostic reports are not going to work. Does there also need to be a letter from the doctor giving the prescription? So I think in addition to looking at the verification of benefits, super important, make sure we're getting good, accurate information, understand those benefits, explain it to the parents, but look at that diagnostic report. Also, diagnostic reports, sometimes they're only good for 3 to 5 years. So looking at the date of those diagnostic reports. Like Georgia Medicaid, super picky about which assessment tools are used. So I have on my desk at all times printed out Georgia Medicaid's requirements, and they even are specific with how old the child needs to be at the time. So I think that all really goes hand in hand with the intake process.
Hi, my name is Jerome Shu. I am the owner of RadBX, and I am a consultant who also a BCBA, and I've worked on the health insurance side as well. Much of my work is helping providers and insurers understand exactly what's happening out in the real world, helping providers understand their contracts, how to ensure compliance clinically and operationally with their contracts with payers. And when it comes to my work with payers, I am sometimes helping them investigate fraud, and sometimes I'm helping them work on maybe complicated cases, medically complex cases where they don't necessarily know how to support one of their members trying to access care. And I'll be working with their medical director and their team trying to figure out how to support them and get the people access to services they need. But I work on both sides. And a big part of my job is trying to right the ship in every little way that I can to make sure that people can access services when they need them, and that the quality of the services that they're accessing are sufficient to help them improve their presentation. We've shared a lot of information. I just want to add a couple things onto the really good information we've already had. Little tips just that you learn from working on the health insurance side. Mackenzie had mentioned getting a photocopy of the health insurance card. I would really strongly recommend you get the front and back copy of that card. And something a lot of people don't know is that specific to each health plan, the members and providers have different numbers when you look at the card. And if a large mental health organization represents 100 different health plans, they have to time the wait times on the calls. So if you call the generic phone line, if you type into Google, I used to work for Beacon, which is now Carelon. If you type into Google, Carelon Provider Relations, it'll give you a generic number. You could be waiting on that line for an hour and a half, and no one's going to pick up the phone. But it's a generic line to which they have no contract where they have to report the time of wait, number of dropped calls, or any issues. If you call the number that's on the back of your patient's health insurance card, those do have logs, wait times, and criteria that they have to uphold. So you're much more likely to get access to someone on the phone faster if you call the number on the card, as opposed to the number you Google. So take note of that. In relation to what Eleanor was saying regarding ensuring that you have all the right information for your funders, I completely agree. Being fully aware of the requirements that the funders have is very important. But I do want to emphasize that we're trying to ensure their patients can access care. And something that I've been seeing happening in some instances is where providers become too stringent and too strict with the requirements to access services. So they'll say, I don't see an ADOS. I'm not even going to submit the request to the payer. And what providers have to understand is, even though they have these contracts with the payers and they know what the funders want, right? Want isn't necessarily what is needed to get them access to services. So I always add in the client experience part, telling a family to go get an ADOS, which could take them 8, 12 months to get, right? Which is absurd, but wait times vary across the country. But when in many instances, if you provide enough information, maybe it is a little bit of a jigsaw puzzle where you're adding in a diagnostic letter from the pediatrician, you're adding reports from EI, you're adding reports and assessments. Maybe some of them are from school. Those are not clinical, I understand, but it sometimes can fill enough information where the assessor can check enough of the boxes where they can still get them in. So, I always advocate for providers to understand that, yes, you definitely have to know the requirements, but 2, ensure that you're advocating on behalf of your patients and trying to help them get access to care.
Yeah, to that point, that is like we're having that big issue with a couple of different companies that we're working with is exactly to what you said. It's a jigsaw puzzle. And it kind of just happened with Georgia Medicaid. There was like a little bit of the child was not quite 24 months, but maybe 24 months. It was a difference of 3 weeks. So what our solution has been is submit what we have, right? Explain to the parents, hey, this is what's going on. This might happen. We're going to submit. We still advise you to, do these things to kind of get a better report, but let's submit and see what happens because they will approve it sometimes, which is great. My fear becomes if they approve it one time and then they don't approve it the next time. Sometimes you see that with Georgia Medicaid. So yeah, exactly to your point. Like, I don't want this child to be waiting for services because we didn't try to submit, right? So that's kind of been our line of what we do is like, okay, we explain to the parent, this is what's going on. This is what we're going to do. We're going to submit everything. We're going to see what happens. But while we submit and while we're waiting in that interim period, I want you to schedule with that diagnostician. I want you to go back to the doctor just in case. And that seems to be working out because then we are not wasting time, but we're also moving in the right direction by having some backups in place. So that's a really good point, Jerome.
Yeah. And I think most companies don't realize that like they do have a personal rep as well. And if they can build a really solid relationship with that person at these payers, it not only is going to help on this front end, like we're saying, but it's going to help when you're having denial issues and you need someone to call because they find you as a trusted partner of like, wow, this company is consistent in what they're doing. And so that's also, I think, really ties into both of those types of things of kind of knowing who your representative is at each funder that you're working with.
My name's Michael. I'm one of the founders at Alpaca Health, where we help BCBAs start, run, and grow their own independent practices. One thing that everybody has seen in the field over the last 5 years is private equity coming in, consolidation coming in, some of which has been good and some of which has been not so good. And we think that families and providers deserve a choice about where they seek care and where they are able to find employment. And we believe that there should be more clinician-owned and operated practices in the world, period. And the reason why there isn't is because running a business, as this whole panel is about, is very difficult. And so Alpaca Health comes in and handles all of the operational side. We get providers credentialed and contracted with preferred rates that we've negotiated with our national network. We provide them technology that's best in class, AI enabled, and easier to use than anything they've touched before. And we do all of the admin tasks. We also offer a guarantee that says we'll pay you every 2 weeks, even if insurance hasn't paid us. So if we don't do our jobs right, we're on the hook, not you, which is very different from how most other billing companies work and how other vendors work. We want to be partners with our practices. We want to invest in our practices. That's why we don't have any upfront fees for people getting started. And I think something that we've learned working with now 50 providers across the country starting practices is how important communication is during the intake process. I think first is communicating with parents about their financial responsibility. We talked about getting that deductible information, getting that copay information during the verification of benefits call, and making sure that your team is asking the right questions. But we need to make sure parents know those words. You have to kind of teach your staff to be able to explain to parents, what is a deductible? What is a copay? What does that mean for patient responsibility and how you're going to have a massive bill in February, but have zero in November? How can you start that communication process earlier, during Thanksgiving, before Thanksgiving, warning parents that you don't have a bill today, but you will have a big bill the beginning of next year when the deductible cliff hits. And so I think that all of this is right about how to handle payers, but then the other question is, how do we take this information and explain it to families in a coherent way? And then I think the other piece is communicating with staff. On these verification of benefits calls, we're going to learn important facts about what a member's plan is eligible for. I know a lot of our providers initially come in with the assumption that, okay, they're in network with some Blues plan, which means that we can do telehealth because we do telehealth with our other Blues client. But it turns out that, yeah, we're in network with them through Blue Cross Blue Shield Texas, but they have a federal plan, or they have a plan from another state where telehealth isn't allowed, or community based services aren't allowed. And so I think a lot of staff members have general assumptions that are wrong based off of a specific plan and specific benefits beneath that plan. And so I think it's not just about getting the right information, but about communicating it with your staff, your clinicians, and of course, your families as well.
Michael, I wanted you to expand on this a bit, and a slight tangent here, but the deductible cliff that you touched on is important. I mean, we're dealing with families that are financially stretched in most cases. And what are you guys doing, all of you? Like, what are some ways that we can soften the deductible cliff blow for those families while not hurting our cash flow?
It's such a good question. I mean, I think a couple of strategies that we use with our practices. Number one is early communication, talking about this problem as early as October and November. So families know that it's going to come and they can make financial decisions around Christmas and Thanksgiving to make sure they have enough in their bank accounts to be able to pay those bills come January. I think part two of this conversation is being flexible with payment plans and having the infrastructure and technology to do it. You as an ABA provider might be able to take that $1,000 bill in January and split it across the year. And you might actually find that to be helpful for your own cash flow needs. You just have to have the ability to make that offer, the ability to track that offer in your technology system. And that's why at Alpaca, as part of our technology system, we have a patient responsibility portal built in that has these sorts of payment plans so that you don't have to do it in another software that may or may not be integrated with your EHR.
Jerome, what's your take from the compliance standpoint and auditing? We have to collect those co-pays.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
Well, you're exactly right. From a compliance perspective, it's part of our contractual obligation to collect those fees. And I really like what Michael said, regarding the option of payment plans, but he's very correct in pointing out that you need to have a system that's able to track that properly and keep people accountable for what they owe. I have worked with a number of groups who haven't maintained their bookkeeping properly, and what they need to understand is if they're not tracking the patient cost sharing fees and payments, if they're not collecting them, that's a breach of contract, and that is an action that can be construed as fraud or fraudulent billing. So you really need to be careful with that. And it's interesting because the ABA comes kind of late to the game for many of these things. But, back in the 90s when HMOs were really popular and patient cost sharing fees varied drastically, this was something that many medical services had done, which was they raised their rates substantially. They would get a high percentage payment from the health plan, and then they would not collect from the patient, right? That's something that kind of disappeared for a while. Because there's very clear case law that says that that's fraudulent, and there's legal precedent to go after providers who do that. And then ABA came along, and now all of a sudden we're starting to see it again. And I'm not saying all providers do this by any account, but I just feel the need to really reinforce that every provider who works with patients who have any sort of patient cost sharing fees, they really need to do everything they can to have their bookkeeping to collect those fees. And while, being flexible when you need to be, if there is a situation where you have to spread payments out over the year, and that's helpful for the family, then, I do think it's responsible to pursue that, but doing it the proper way by ensuring that you are doing your diligence to make sure that there is actually some sort of financial hardship. The family is signing an attestation stating that they are facing hardship, and that you're not presenting as if you're letting them not pay.
I have a quick question, and I run the risk because I know that all three of you, Jerome, Mackenzie, and Michael, all do more billing and I do more clinical. So I know I'm running the risk, but maybe other clinicians like me are listening, will listen back. But how do you handle when, and I don't know if, again, I hope I don't sound too silly with this question, but with medicating, you're not allowed to collect fees from parents. So like if a child has Blue Cross Blue Shield as primary, and then there is a copay, but then they have secondary Medicaid, and then Medicaid says that you're not allowed to collect any additional fees from the parents, or there's a discrepancy or whatever it is, how would you separate that in your bookkeeping if there is a primary and secondary and Medicaid is involved and copays are involved? Again, I don't know if I'm communicating that correctly, but maybe you guys will have a better understanding on what I'm trying to ask.
I could definitely try to provide some clarification on that. So it isn't necessarily a rule that secondary, even if it is Medicaid, that you cannot bill, period. Generally speaking, you don't bill directly to the patient, but you can hold the secondary accountable for many of those patient cost sharing fees in many states. It's not universal across. I mean, Medicaid's a state, run mandate, so it doesn't always work in every state. But generally speaking, the rule is that Medicaid will cover the fees up to the rate that has been set by that state. So if the Blue Cross plan, and I'm using that for example because that was the one that was brought out, but if a Blue Cross plan pays $100 an hour and the Medicaid rate also pays $100 an hour, and there's a $20 copay, it often is the case that Medicaid would cover the patient cost sharing fees, again, state by state. However, if the Blue Cross rate was $150 an hour and the Medicaid rate was $100 an hour, and you're a provider who's contracted with both Blue Cross and Medicaid, so you have to follow all the rules, then in that instance, you technically would not be able to collect those fees from the family if, let's say it was $20 copay, because it's over the rate of Medicaid. So it's not a hard, fast rule. When it comes to Medicaid, much of it is set by precedents and processes. But the best way to do this, typically, because benefits are so varied and complicated, is to submit the EOBs, submit the claims to secondary, even if you're not sure, see what happens and what shakes out. If the EOB comes back and says there's no payment, then you've done your due diligence. You found out that for that one particular benefit and that patient in the circumstance, it's not going to pay. But really, my rule of thumb is to always submit the claims to the payers, because it's amazing. More often than not, they come back paid because they have systems in place and whole legal teams to check every piece of eligibility day by day, and they get it right way more often than the provider because they have all resources. So submit the claim.
Okay, that's really good, because that is what happened. And I think in the situation that I'm thinking of, it was similar to kind of what you said, with the one rate being higher, and then they couldn't collect, and they did submit, and I think it came back and said no, like they didn't get it, but it was submitted to kind of check that. And you explained that much better than my jet lag brain could do right now. So thank you. So going from intake, do they have the benefit? Have we submitted all of the correct documentation to show that they have the diagnosis? Then the behavior analyst needs to do their assessment, and then they need to submit that treatment plan. And that's where the goals are. And as from a clinician's point of view, that's where I'm seeing denials. And to be honest, some of the denials I'm seeing, they're fixable, right? The BCBAs need to have a little bit of training on that. So maybe that would be my next logical place to jump.
And are you stating, Eleanor, that your clients are seeing denials and that they're not even getting an authorization to begin with?
I'm seeing more of that with Georgia Medicaid right now. I am seeing a lot of interesting things happen with Georgia Medicaid that I wasn't seeing a few months ago. Yeah, I'm kind of seeing it all over the place. But again, it's mainly Georgia, but I have a few other states now that I'm also working with.
And I'm sure Jerome can speak to this too very eloquently, just from his experience working with payers. But again, it's just so important to know what the requirements are within the treatment plans for each individual payer. A perfect example is, so if you're writing treatment goals for TRICARE, if you put in anything that has to do with potty training, food training, sleep training, like NAP, if you put any of those types of language in that treatment plan, it will automatically get denied. And so it's really important, like you said, to be able to understand what needs to be put within the treatment plans. And again, when I was working clinically as a BCBA, I feel like I learned so much within my first year of what not to do, because so many of my treatment plans were getting denied. And this was back like 12 years ago. But it made me a really great, not to puff myself up, but a really great supervisor, because as I was training other BCBAs how to write treatment plans, it was, hey, this is how we need to do it for Cigna. This is how we need to do it for Aetna. And these are the reasons why. We're still going to achieve our clinical goals that we're working with, both with the family and per our assessment, but we have to learn how to speak the language that the payer is looking for. And you have to be able to navigate that and switch. But if we're not disseminating that down to our clinicians, and then not even to that, but to how our notes are being taken from the RBTs, if you get audited, which you will get audited at some point in time from a payer. These antecedent measures will allow you to not feel like, oh my gosh, it's like, no, you should be prepared for audits, because it's part of your operational system as preparing your notes and preparing your treatment plans. And so when it comes to a denial or acceptance of the authorization, again, it just comes down to knowing your payer and knowing how to curate a treatment plan that meets their goals and requirements. And so a lot of the clients I work for will have a template. If we have a client for TRICARE, these are all the goals we need to be hitting. These are all the checkboxes that need to be marked. Cigna client, same thing. Aetna client, same thing, because there are nuances that are different between them. Jerome, I'm actually super interested to hear your perspective, having worked with different payers from that side of things, because it can often, I think, from a clinical side, feel like a puzzle to be solved. It's like you said, at the end of the day, if I'm advocating for my client to get 40 hours a week, I have to know what needs to be done to get that authorization approved before I even have to deal with denials of the sessions that are even taking place.
So I would like to jump in here, and I don't mean to capitalize the conversation, but this is really kind of a sweet spot of what I work on. So the reality is that if you're a provider and you want to get your 40-hour treatment plan authorized, you need to ensure that you are presenting why the services are medically necessary per the level of care of that particular health plan, which might have things like, in TRICARE's example, language that has things that you can work on and what you can't work on, right? And if you're trying to ask for something and it specifically says in the medical criteria that you can't do that, you're immediately walking into a denial. What I found is that many BCDAs don't have access to those documents because usually the provider, the organization has those contracts, has access. They have passwords to get into the system to get those documents. Most of the individual clinicians do not. So I would start off by saying, make sure you know what that level of care is. Make sure you understand what it says you can do and what you can't do, what's exclusionary, what is allowed. And if you don't have access to the document, a really safe way to do it is to make sure that every goal that you write for treatment of, based upon your individualized assessment, aligns with a deficit identified by the diagnosis of ASD. If you're treating actual criteria that align with the diagnosis of ASD and the health plan is required to fund services for ASD, you're not going to get a denial. The problem is when we start stretching outside the bounds of what aligns with the actual diagnostic criteria for the DSM-5, that's where the medical denials are occurring. And I'm not saying we shouldn't, from my perspective, yes, we absolutely should be able to work on potty training. We should be able to work on feeding. We should be able to work on pill swallowing. However, I understand that for some health plans, they do have a specific lane to which they have another specialty that does that. The important thing is that you know what that criteria is. Because the reality is, if you submit a treatment plan and in the level of care, it says you cannot work on vocational services, educational services, it'll say explicitly says daily living activities. If that's the case and you put that in a treatment plan, what do you think that reviewer thinks of you as a clinician? Right? You're literally asking for something that you signed a contract saying, I'm going to abide by the level of care. And you're asking for something that's exclusionary. It doesn't make you look very good because it makes you look like you don't know what you're doing. The step one is for all the clinicians to know what that criteria is. And if you're a clinician and you're writing treatment plans and you've never seen this document or you don't know what I'm talking about, ask the organizations you work with for access to these documents because they should have all of them.
I think a lot of times I see ABA organizations talk a lot about process to solve these things. And I think that usually for most organizations just means better training. So I'm going to do some slide decks and we're going to have some quarterly BCBA team to go through reasons why treatment plans have been denied. And there's sort of like the learning of institutional knowledge. But it feels like there's a lot. The process can mean other things, right? It could mean an SOP and additional layers of review. It could mean a checklist for your clinical team. It could also mean better technology. And I think this is where a lot of organizations don't think about because it's not what most BCBAs were kind of trained to think about is what if technology could do the review? What if you had a technology system that embedded the checklist within it? What if you found a technology system that made your treatment plans compliant by default? And of course, there's a lot of buzz about AI, and we've built AI into our EHR. I think there's a lot of opportunity for AI to both generate parts of the treatment plan by payer standards and by the different documents that patients and families are providing. I also think there's opportunity on the backside for AI to do an audit and flag the most obvious things that are happening, right? You've used the word potty training. That gets denied. Go fix it. Colorado Medicaid denies everything to do with fidget spinners. don't mention the fidget spinner or the fidget tool, as one of my BCBAs likes to call it. And so I think as we're talking about all these things, there's easy, medium, and hard ways to kind of go about solving it. And I'm not saying everybody should go figure out an AI solution for their practice yesterday, but I think as folks grow, training is going to get harder. So how do you more efficiently embed that process without all this layer of human review and then training?
I think if we look at the simplest reason for me, this is what I've been noticing lately, right? Is that, especially when it comes to writing these goals and this idea of medical necessity and why BCBAs get confused with it. And I have a couple of my own cases, children that I still help oversee. And I think it's really helpful for me as a consultant to keep me grounded in the field. Like if I'm giving advice and I'm writing treatment plans also. So it's been really helpful for me. And I think the big issue is that the assessments that BCBAs are told to use, right? So we have the VB-MAP, the ABLE, the AFOLD. These assessments predate the idea of writing goals that are medically necessary. So for instance, in our VB-MAP, we have, can the child match words to pictures or like letters? And do they know the first 5 letters and can they count? If I were to put a goal that is directly from the VB-MAP into a math health, it would get denied, even though math health, that's another funder I work with, math health will say, use these assessments, you can, whatever, if VB-MAP is an acceptable assessment to use, but then you use a criteria from the VB-MAP as a goal, well, so I think BCBAs need training on, hey, like some of our assessments are older. The VB-MAP is quite old, so is the ABLE. So how do you, and I think it goes back to the idea of training, right? Rather than being mad at the funder, right? Like, how do we train the BCBA to say, okay, I know that the VB-MAP assesses for writing, but I know I can't, or letters, but I know I can't put a identifying letters goal into my report because it's seen as academic. And not all funders, right? Like some funders you work with are fine with that goal, but other funders will come back and say, I put the word shaped in a treatment plan. And the clinical director is like, they might deny it. We have to take the word. It was sorting. It was sorting and I put sorting shapes. And so we had to take the word shapes out because that could be seen as academic. Yeah. So just things like that. And I think it kind of goes back to the idea of the assessments that the clinicians are using. So then that's where their mindset is that they're not necessarily trained in the diagnostic criteria. So then BCBAs need to have training in that idea of, okay, linking medical necessity back to the DSM criteria. And so to bring it full circle to one of the things I do is when I'm putting together treatment plans for companies, I encourage them to use goal banks and I encourage them to have, obviously individualized goals once you get them in. But if you're using a goal bank that has been verified by your clinical director and has been used for other treatment plan goals, then we know the funders are going to accept these and they eliminate the academic or whatever it is, if it's TRICARE, the specific things TRICARE has. So yeah, I think part of it goes back to the assessments BCBAs are using and just training the BCBAs on how to write these goals to make them medically necessary.
So if I can jump in really quick on that, you're correct. The assessments, but those assessments were not designed to create a medically necessary treatment plan. They were designed to assess the skills of a patient of a wide breadth that is a completely different lane than medically necessary treatment. So you're right. Every BCBA needs more training on this. This is a topic that many BCBAs are confused on, and I'm all for more training in this space. But you have to understand that we're given tools, and it's still up to the BCBA to distill all the information down and to create the plan that does align with medically necessary treatment. You're right. There is no individualized assessment that produces any sort of medically necessary treatment. And that would be great if that would come out. If anyone wants to work on that, I'm certainly interested. But at this point, it is a little bit of a square hole situation where there is no perfect tool, nor should there be with ABA, given the sense that all the services are supposed to be individualized based on the assessment of every individual patient. It's good that there's a wide breadth of assessments that have things that fall in and outside the bounds of medically necessary care. So I do think the whole industry needs a lot to develop, and we need more tools, and we need more refined and more training in the concept of medically necessary care. For everyone who's listening to this right now, I certainly would promote you seeking out more guidance in this area, because there's no way we can deep dive this concept in the brief amount of time we have today. But this is definitely something that the whole industry needs to get better at, without question.
To me, the next important piece is really understanding your technology. What Michael was talking about in terms of just like understanding how people are maximizing and utilizing their technology. Because from a billing perspective, once that session note is done, and first of all, your session note should be converted, completely signed, meet all the criteria, great. But when we move into the billing piece of it, your information in your technology is only as good as you set it up. And I think that's the big piece. A lot of BCBAs who go out on their own, who don't know how to utilize technology because somebody else was running their CRM for them, and all they have to do is go in and write session notes and then convert them. That's where the next big piece comes into play, in my opinion, in terms of preventable denial reasons, because the inputs that you can control need to be input correctly. So from authorization numbers, date of birth, the way that clients' names are spelled, that sounds so simple, but it can become an issue, to how we're doing modifiers for each specific payer, how it's added correctly, and then ensuring your technology can actually work correctly to support what you're doing. If you don't have your technology set up correctly, you're going to get denials left and right. And so understanding the technology that you've chosen and how it does your billing and who is responsible for overseeing the inputs and how its claims are being sent out, I believe is one of the easiest antecedent procedures in place for not running into denial issues. But because new business owners are so excited about new clients and intakes and marketing and things like that, I feel like it's one of the areas where people have most human error, is how they're setting up their technology to do their billing efficiently.
I agree. And I think getting organized, to your point, Mackenzie. So you have new providers that come in, and that's kind of the biggest thing, at least with one of the platforms I work on within Central Reach. Is Central Reach has, I think, a lot of really great benefits, and there's a lot of really cool things you can do with it. It's just a really big learning curve. And if you create any sort of error, the spelling of the name, putting in the wrong member ID, whatever it is, you will get those denials. So getting those things set up and organized at the upfront for any new provider, even if you're not a new provider, I think is so important, from the clinical side to the billing side of any EMR system or software that you're using. I think it's having really good, clear organization to help those processes run smoothly.
I think there's kind of things from an upstream technology perspective too. For instance, if you know your payer requires RBT credentialing, why should a technology system allow you to schedule a session with an uncredentialed RBT? Because you know that claim is going to be denied, or it's going to have to be incorrectly or fraudulently submitted to get approved. And so I think a lot of this has to do with, hey, how does your billing system work? Does it understand modifiers? But I think there's so many upstream things that if you have an end-to-end solution that does billing and scheduling, there ought to be more connections between. And I think the difficult part of designing technology is that these standards change, right? Like RBT credentialing wasn't a thing when ABA first became insurance reimbursable, and now it's increasingly becoming more and more of a trend. And so it is not straightforward. Like, as a technology developer, I sympathize with every other EHR platform out there that has to navigate those trends. I think it's just a matter of picking the technology partner that will react to payer changes with you and who will be fast in that regard. And it feels like it's not just us who's like a small, nimble player that's new. There's a lot of great new technology companies that have this characteristic of, we're small, we're early, we're a small engineering team, we can make changes on the fly that might be worth looking at if you are in a situation where payers are changing requirements and your technology is not keeping up.
That's really smart, Michael.
One of the things that we're always working on, like, I'm in the tech world all day, and I think it's important to have good technology in place. But one of the things that I think is a major weakness in most businesses, even outside of ABA, the dependence on a technology to sustain your business. One of the things that I encourage ABA owners to do is to get at least a surface level understanding of each phase of their business, each process within their functional areas, to at least know what's happening within that magic box, so that when something goes wrong, they're able to surmise at least the general area of where the problem is. working our way through the life cycle slowly here. We have our HR processes, which I also wanted to talk about that Michael touched on. Your HR processes protecting your company from people not being credentialed that need to be credentialed for a certain payer, or licensing and certifications going out of date. Moving from that client intake, we've gotten into the care plan. Out of the rest of that chain, going all the way through that journey, what's the hot zone where you're seeing the most denials coming from?
So I'm not necessarily sure about denials, because denials typically happen from the treatment plan being submitted. But if you're going to talk about recoupments, we're going to talk about failing audits and what happens on the back end of this process. So if you've delivered services, you have the notes and you get it reviewed in audit. What I'm finding is that many of the, and this doesn't lie with the conversation regarding EHRs and the whole system, all different systems that are out there. What I've found is that many of those systems have templates for each specific code and service. However, many of those templates are deficient relative to industry standards. And what I would advise every group that uses an EHR and a template for notes is to reference the templates you use relative to the two industry standards that currently exist, one of which is the BHCOE documentation standards that very clearly indicates all the critical information you need to note. And the other would be the CASP session note templates that has and I would qualify both of those as being the minimum criteria, minimum amount of information you need to meet compliance standards. So what am I seeing? If I see a group that doesn't have sufficient information to substantiate the services delivered, we're seeing recoupments. So your provider saying they worked with a kiddo for 6 hours that day, and you look at the note and it said, Billy smiled at me when we walked in the door. We had lunch. He had a great session today. Done. Right? You're not getting paid. That is not a session you're keeping that money for. The health plan's coming after you for that, because he doesn't have anything about what was the date of service, what was the start and the end time, what's the MPI number for the clinician who's managing the case. There's so much information that's missing from that note. And providers need to understand that it is your contractual obligation to maintain your medical records to a level which meets industry standards, of which we now have them. 10 years ago, this was a totally different conversation because there was no BHCOE, there was no CASP or ACQ setting industry standards. Now we have them. So that's a double-edged sword. Now we have a line in the sand to the information we're supposed to have. And if your notes don't meet that standard, then you're typically running into issues with recruitments. So I would say right off the bat, if you look at your session notes and you look at the standards that have been published by the BHCOE and CASP, if you're not meeting that standard, you need to stop and figure out how to address that, or advocate in your company to revamp those templates, ask for more training, establish standards internally to ensure that you're protecting yourselves and your company and your patients.
Exactly. Because I find too, Jerome, that a lot of people who leave larger companies, who are leaving companies that for whatever reason they choose to leave, they're so uneducated sometimes on just the process within their state with each payer, right? So for Medicaid, like in New Jersey, if a small company chose to do a third-party biller because they should be well-versed in their billing but don't want to do their billing, and they're being charged a percentage and they get audited, Medicaid will recoup everything that was billed out by that company simply because they were being charged a percentage, right? And there's so many people who have gotten into the ABA space because it is profitable, it is lucrative for many different reasons, who aren't educated themselves. And so I think it's also important, from a billing perspective, if you choose to work with a third-party company or a company, like Michael's, or a company like Ohana Support, you have to ensure that that company knows what the heck they're doing, that they've done their due diligence, that they've done their compliance, they know the policies within each of these states for these payers, because there's a lot of people not doing a lot of great work. And we all think we can skate by until we don't. And I think one of my biggest fears, and I know this will never happen because I know that we do things ethically, morally, the way they need to be done, but would be somebody gets a recoupment because of my doing, right? My work as a biller, or my work as a company that's supporting their operations. And so I think it's also just so important to vet who you're working with and why you're choosing to work with them, because Derek just said every business owner should know how each of their departments are run, but that doesn't mean they need to be the expert in that department, right? You should know what your billing functions are. You should know what modifiers are. You should know why your taxonomy code is important and why it should be on your claim, and why if you have a multidisciplinary clinic, you can't have the taxonomy code for OT on your ABA claims. So I think it's about educating yourself as a business owner on the processes that are going to allow you to be successful in the field so that you can focus on clinical quality and the clients that you're working with and how you're doing it. And then you can trust somebody who is an expert in billing, in credentialing, in things like scheduling or quality assurance for auditing your notes to be taking over that with confidence. And I think it's just that balance of there's so many voices in this space and everyone's trying to be heard. I mean, don't get me wrong. I do the same thing, right? We want our voice to be heard, but it's knowing, what's going to allow you to achieve your own personal company's goals. Because everybody has different goals getting in the field. Some people just want to be in a BCBA, working with a few clients and doing high quality work. Amazing. We need more BCBAs like that. Some people are like, nah, I want to be in 10 states, right? I want to be launching clinics. Like Michael, you said you're in Colorado, launching more clinics. And then as individuals who support these companies, knowing that we've done our due diligence to support them with the right information, I think I carry that weight very seriously of just the continual education of ourselves, of, like you said, Michael, your technology, and Jerome, your knowledge of the payer side of things and how we support the companies to be most successful, knowing that they're relying on our expertise to take the next step forward in their business. I think it's such a beautiful, I feel so blessed that we get to do what we do and serve the people that we serve. And at the end of the day, knowing that it's the client that is benefiting the most from the ecosystem of support that we're creating. I feel like that's just what I've gathered from this conversation of each of your areas of expertise are just allowing business owners to sleep a little easier at night, knowing that there's an expert who has done their due diligence within these areas that you're supporting your clients in, which I think is really cool.
Yeah, you don't have to be a black belt in everything. Just get to enough of a level where you've done this, you've studied it, you understand enough about it. You don't have to be an auto mechanic to know when there's something wrong with your car. Is the noise coming from the front or the back? We need to know basic stuff about all the systems overall. Michael, what are our insurance denial hotspots?
Sure. I think one has to be claims without authorizations, because folks are late on getting reassessments done because they don't have the technology or process to remind their team to finish those up. Two has to be increasingly pre-payment audits. We've seen that happen in a couple of states where you assume you'll get an audit after you get the money and then you can clean up your notes, but now that's increasingly changing. And then three, something very specific to working with Medicaids in some states that have electronic visit verification. If you are a practice that doesn't have an integrated solution, you actually have to have your staff clock in on electronic visit verification to tell the state when the session started and ended, as well as have the staff member start and convert their note on your EHR, which is way too much for an overall clinician to do. And so something we've solved by integrating the solutions together, but something we still see when out in the field talking to clinics.
I think just to wrap it up for me is that the places I'm seeing the denials are in the treatment plans. How do behavior analysts write treatment plans that are not going to be denied, but also have good quality outcomes for the child or the individual, if it's an older individual? Teaching the behavior analyst, how do we write these treatment plans? How do we use templates that make sense and are organized? How do we look at what our funders are requiring and know those requirements, keeping up with their changes and making sure that we are adequately changing that? So all the way from the business owner, the clinical director, to the behavior analyst, everyone needs to know. And again, to your point, Mackenzie, they don't need to be an expert in all of those things, but they need to understand that treatment plans are saying we're going to do for the next 6 months. And how do we make this a good quality treatment plan? I think also, and we didn't even really touch on this too much, but I think behavior analysts need to take a little bit more ownership in understanding billing codes and how we bill appropriately so we're not fraudulently billing. The ABA Billing Coalition sets a standard, and while funders have the ability to do their own thing, behavior analysts need to understand those billing codes. They need to know that they can only bill 5/5 if they're with the client, if they're in the presence, and making sure that these requirements are known, because that's going to, not only is it going to reduce fraud, which we definitely want to do, but it's also going to improve the quality of services that are given to that child or individual. So 2 things: get the treatment plans that are good quality, clearly written. They're not a wacky template that makes no sense with poor formatting. And then 2, the behavior analyst needs to take ownership on those billing codes. They're signing those notes, converting that appointment. They need to take ownership on knowing what that billing code is. If their company they're working for isn't giving them that information, I think the behavior analyst needs to push back and do some research on their own and get some continuing education, because again, they're signing off on those notes. So those are my 2 big take homes, right? Clear reports, know your billing codes.
Well, last thing I just want to add on to what Eleanor said. I'm so happy she brought up the ABA Coalition. It's an amazing resource that everyone should be using.
Sounds so good.
And I do know that obviously this group was brought together by a number of conversations, many conversations that have happened on the Facebook group. And I think many of those are excellent conversations and knowledgeable. But I will say that when it comes to things like billing, you should not be asking people on Facebook for advice. Please go to the coalition. It's a free resource. You can send them questions about whatever issue you have, send them the scenario you're working on. They send back resources.
They send back answers. I emailed them and told them they needed to change the name of 55 to 55. I said, you need to not make this a protocol modification. Anyways, it was a silly request I gave to them because the BCBAs are confused, but you're right. They respond. So that's a really good point.
So that's just my last piece, because I've seen many comments happening online with people giving advice about what to bill and how to bill.
That's wrong.
And just be careful.
Manage.
Be careful out there. That's all.
Yeah.
And Jerome, I wholeheartedly agree. Like, we've worked so hard to build this group up and get people to interact and bring people in to give them help. But we do see a lot of bad advice happening on these forums. And we're always there advocating for make sure that you have supporting evidence for these decisions that you're making. You can learn a lot from interacting with other business owners. But one of the things we're always talking about in the Odyssey on our weekly calls is first principles. We don't do something because that's what we used to do at our last place of work. We do something because it's justified, it makes sense, and it's backed up with, I know where Jerome's going to go right away. The payer contract. Exactly where are we getting our justification for this process working this way? That's it. First principles. You have to make sure you're checking your sources.
Really appreciate everybody joining tonight. Mackenzie from Arohana, Michael from Alpaca Health, Jerome from RadBX, and Eleanor from Clear Clinical Consulting. I'll make sure all of that information is in the description when we post the video.
Yeah, it was great.
Great. Thank you very much.
Yeah,
Good
thanks
night.
everybody.
Bye.
Thank you, guys.
Bye.
You're already doing the work, investing your time, your energy, and your vision. So let's make it count. Build something that works without breaking you. The eBCBA Blueprint is the way. Get started for free with our foundation course.